Okay, so welcome to Case Studies in Archaeology. This is a new YouTube channel I've decided to put together. I'll be presenting a series of case studies in archaeology and Egyptology over the coming months. My name's Dave Lightbody. I'm an archaeologist trained at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. So I've really decided to put this channel together due to the amount of misinformation that's been going online, particularly in the field of archaeology and Egyptology. We've seen in recent months the dangers when the scientific method is not followed and when scientific information is ignored or sidelined. So really it's become quite pressing that there's some kind of response put online. So this is what I'm going to try to do. So when properly applied, archaeology is a scientific tool. It is a method of thinking, logical machine that leads us towards accurate knowledge of the past based on whatever data set we've been presented with. So I'm going to look at some of the principles that allow us to do good archaeology, but I'm also going to look at something that's equally important, which is the pitfalls that need to be avoided. And these are often referred to as logical fallacies, and these are what can lead people astray. When you're doing archaeology, there's usually only one accurate interpretation of the data, and there's 100 ways to misinterpret it. So we really need to be careful and be aware of the pitfalls. So in this case study today, I'm going to be looking at a very famous archaeological site, and I'll be looking at a particular logical fallacy. And the site I'm going to look at is KV62, and this is the tomb of Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. And the logical fallacy I'm going to be looking at is an informal logical fallacy called wishful thinking. And I'm going to look at how that's affected the way data from the tomb has been interpreted in recent years. In 2015, Egyptologist Dr. Nick Reeves published a hypothesis online. It wasn't peer-reviewed, it was very much a preliminary hypothesis. And his hypothesis was that based on some recent scans, he concluded that Nefertiti was buried behind the north wall in Tutankhamun's tomb. So I read the article at the time, and despite the fact that it's not peer-reviewed, it's perfectly legitimate to put forward a hypothesis, which it was at that time. But really, over the past few years, this has been investigated, and I just want to read the conclusion of the latest radar scans, and this was accepted by the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. After careful data processing, no evidence of marked discontinuities due to the passage from natural rock to artificial blocking walls were found in the radargrams. It is therefore concluded that there are no hidden chambers immediately adjacent to the tomb of Tutankhamun. So this was the results of the latest, most comprehensive radar scans, and that's really quite clear. So what I'm going to look at is the evidence that's been gathered over the years, and I'm going to look at where the project went wrong and how they have arrived at an incorrect conclusion, despite the latest studies, scientific studies, providing evidence to the contrary. So when I was getting ready to make this video, I made sure I did my homework to cover all the bases, and I read all of the papers that have been put online by Nick Reeves. I read the report from the Getty Conservation Institute, who did a lot of work looking at the murals. I also read the scientific reports that have been published by the Polytechnic University of Milan, presenting the radar data. And I read many of the reports that have been put out on the other radar surveys. And I did a lot of background research on the general media hype that involved the investigations that surrounded this tomb. I also constructed a 3D model of the tomb, which allowed me to study the architecture in more detail and the radar surveys, and look at. I was able to compare the different radar surveys. And I put a bibliography at the end of this video. You can see all of these documents for yourself. So to present the data, I have organised the evidence that was gathered into 3 classes of evidence, and I'm going to look at them consecutively. The first one is superficial evidence, and that's the superficial evidence from the walls of the tombs. The second one is circumstantial evidence, and that's information that Reeves derived from the artistic programme on the walls and also from the architectural layout of the existing tomb. And the third class of evidence I want to look at is the hard radar evidence of the 3 GPR ground penetrating radars surveys. At the end, I'm going to summarise all of the data together, and I'm going to look at the lessons that can be learned from this project before I reach a conclusion. So first up, I want to look at the superficial evidence. So a little bit of background to the evidence and the hypotheses. Really goes right back, obviously, to the death of Tutankhamun in 1323 BC. He died around about 18 or 19 years old, relatively young and probably unexpectedly. And he was buried in a rather small tomb, quite low down the Valley of the Kings, towards the end of the 18th dynasty. The tomb has 4 rooms in it, and it looks as though it was an existing tomb that was hastily converted for the young boy king. After he was interred there, the tomb was broken into briefly, soon after he was interred there, but there wasn't a lot of damage done, and it was closed off again. Subsequently, there was another tomb built over it, above it on the hillside, KV9, which belonged to Ramses V and was reused by Ramses VI. And a lot of the debris from the building of that tomb fell down the hillside and covered the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. There was also flash flooding over the years, which swept more debris down the valley. And subsequently, some workmen's huts were built over the pile of debris during the Ramesside period. So the tomb was well hidden, and it was not until 1922 that it was found by Howard Carter. He excavated the tomb very carefully over 8 years, extracted all of the fantastic artifacts that were found in there. And he found 4 rooms that were accessed from an entrance corridor. The entrance corridor led down 16 steps into a long sloping corridor that led into an antechamber, reasonably large antechamber. Opposite the entrance was a smaller chamber that was sealed off, known as the annex. To the north is the large burial chamber where all of the fantastic golden sarcophagus and coffins and crates were found. That's the main room we're going to look at today. And to the east was coming off the burial chamber is the 4th chamber, known as the treasury. So Howard Carter excavated the whole tomb, and so fast forward now to 2002, English-Spanish company known as Factum Arte started producing replicas of tombs. They produced a great replica of KV35, which was the tomb of Thutmose III. One of their replicas went on a tour around museums, and I went to see it in Edinburgh. I was very impressed by it, and it's very similar to the real tomb, which I had recently visited before that. And in 2009, Factum Arte proposed to the Department of Antiquities in Egypt that they could create a replica of KV62, the tomb of Tutankhamun. And that would be great because tourists could then visit the exact replica rather than going to see the ancient tomb, which is going to suffer damage as a result of over-tourism. So over the next between 2009 and 2012, the team carried out detailed scans inside KV62 using a laser scanner, which scans the surfaces of the walls in great detail. And they produced a perfect replica, or near perfect replica, of the tomb. In 2014, that was installed near Howard Carter's house, which is still surviving down at the bottom of the valley. And as well as installing the tomb, which was open to the public in 2014, they put all of their detailed laser scans online in a searchable fashion. And this is really the start of the new hypothesis, because Egyptologist Nick Reeves studied these scans that were put online in detail, and he came to the conclusion, based on a lot of details in the scans, that he could see evidence that there may be door frames and lintels under the surface of the plastered wall surfaces. So, in the abstract, he published a hypothesis online in 2015, and in the abstract he wrote that recently published high-resolution scans of the walls reveal beneath the plastered surfaces of the painted scenes distinct linear traces. He also, page 1, he wrote, for the archaeologists, these files possess a further potential to be investigated here, namely what they might be coaxed to reveal about the architecture of the tomb beneath the decoration. The short answer seems to be a great deal. And then on page 5 he wrote, close examination of these surface scans reveals, beneath the plaster, several features in shallow relief. So I had read the report in 2015, and I was a little bit concerned by the connection he was making between the surface features and what may be underneath the surface. And it's not necessarily a legitimate connection to make. He specifically says here, close examination of these surface scans reveals beneath the plaster. Now, I was a little bit concerned when I read that, because if we look at how the ancient Egyptians constructed these tombs, they chiseled them out of the bedrock using copper chisels and leaving a fairly rough wall behind. And in order to provide a nice, neat surface for the paintings, they would cover the wall in a layer of mud plaster and then a lighter limestone thin wash of plaster, and then they would apply their colours, their paints on top of that surface. And the reason they applied the layers of muddy plaster was to hide any features that were below the plaster. And so really the reason the plaster was there is to hide all irregularities under the plaster. So what we can see usually on the top of the plaster, any irregularities, are the result of the workmanship of the final worker who applied the final layer of plaster. So making direct connections between the surface and what's under it is not necessarily legitimate. And in this case, we can see with these scans, these laser scans carried out by Factum Arte, these were not scans that could see below the surface of the wall. These were scans, the laser bounces directly off the uppermost surface of the walls. So really, it doesn't necessarily tell you anything about what's under the plaster or in the walls. So I was a little bit concerned about that at the time, but I was interested to see if anything further would come of the hypothesis that Nefertiti was therefore buried behind the wall. But I kept my sceptical head on and waited to see what more evidence was forthcoming. So subsequently I did some more research, and we can see from the Getty Conservation Institute findings, they published a report around about 2014 as well, reporting findings, and what they found by studying the walls was multiple thin layers of plaster that had been applied. And they were unable to see from their very close studies how thick these were. Basically, it's very difficult for them to see into the walls, even using X-ray, because there's nothing behind the wall that they can X-ray through to. So they're basically looking at the surfaces of the walls like everybody else. But based on all of these investigations and Nick Reeves' hypothesis, there was a call put out to carry out radar surveys of the walls, and we're going to look at those shortly after. Now I want to look at the second class of evidence, the circumstantial evidence that Reeves brought in. This is in two parts, the artistic program and the architectural layout. So Nick Reeves is an expert on the art history of the Valley of the Kings, and also on the architecture to some extent. So he looked at the artistic program on the walls of the tomb, what religious scenes were put on there by the ancient Egyptians, to see what they could tell us about the history of the tomb. On the north wall in particular, the Getty Conservation Institute had found that the wall was painted slightly differently from the other walls. And on the north wall, the yellow background that had been applied to the scene was painted around the figures, whereas on the other walls of the tomb chamber, the yellow background was painted on first and the scenes were painted over that. So Reeves suggested that this was because on the north wall of the burial chamber, there already had been a scene there, and it was adapted by Tutankhamun's workmen. And he suggested that the reason that there was a scene there already was because it was covering up a plastered over wall which had hidden the entrance into Nefertiti's own burial chamber. So he suggested that this showed the existing figures that were on that wall were just repurposed for Tutankhamun's burial, and yellow paint had been painted round because this was Tutankhamun's golden burial chamber, and the names of the characters in the scenes had been changed so that they showed, instead of, in particular, that we're looking at one scene here, which is the opening of the mouth scene. Now it shows Tutankhamun as the deceased, having his mouth opened by his successor. In this case, it's old Uncle I, who had stepped in to take over. And so what Reeves suggested was this was actually a repurposed scene that had originally shown Nefertiti as the deceased and Tutankhamun performing the opening of the mouth ritual. So he suggested that, in fact, we could turn to evidence of the actual faces of the characters depicted, and he suggested that these actually, the faces actually more resembled Nefertiti and Tutankhamun rather than Tutankhamun and Uncle I. So it's a very persuasive argument, and I'm not an art historian, so I was not going to tackle that evidence head on. So what I did do, though, is I turned to other experts in the field, and I looked at what they'd read and what conclusions they'd drawn regarding this hypothesis. So the two people I turned to was Traugott Huber of the University of Zurich and Nick Hardwick of the Houston Museum of Natural History. And both of these experts on the tomb have put forward critiques of Reeves's theory, and they put forward their own alternative hypotheses. So they didn't agree with his conclusions. And Tom Hardwick in particular, his comment was that the problem is that Tut looks like Tut and I actually looks like I, just as we've always assumed. So really that, for me, that meant that the circumstantial evidence from the artwork was not really convincing. Now I'm going to turn now to the architectural layout, and one of the issues that Reeves had relied on was that a right turn at the entrance to the tomb suggested this was a tomb of a female, and he suggested that tombs in the valley that went straight on had a central long access for the male buried members of the royal family, and the ones that turned right were for the female members of the royal family. Now, seems a very nice, simple rule to follow, but in actual fact, there's so many exceptions to this that it cannot be considered a hard and fast rule. We can see, for example, even in the valley itself, there's exceptions to this. KV20, originally built for Thutmose I, has a right turn. And KV7 for Ramses III also has a right turn within the tomb. So this really is not proof of anything, and at very most it's a possible indicator that this may have been built for a female, but really not convincing. He also suggested that most of the burial chambers in the valley have extra rooms coming off the main burial chamber, and so we should conclude that there are other chambers leading off the burial chamber. And in fact, in his latest hypothesis, he suggests no less than 3 separate rooms coming off the burial chamber, one in the north, one in the west, and one in the south. So really, this is stretching the evidence from previous tombs too far. Now, We can turn to previous tombs to give us guidance on what we might expect, but that's very different to establishing hard and fast rules that we use to indicate what is definitely in the current tomb we're looking at. So a similar example is the Old Kingdom pyramids. At first sight, they look very regular, very repetitive, and we can expect to find very similar layouts inside, but we don't find that. We find a lot of variation due to all sorts of reasons, religious reasons, and also reasons relating to the history of the reign. Often pharaohs died prematurely or they had extremely long reign lengths, and this affects the final layout of their own tombs.
So in conclusion, neither the evidence from the artistic programme nor the evidence from the architectural layout provides compelling support of the hypothesis.
Okay, so now I want to look at the last class of evidence, and this is the radar evidence from the project. Now this needs to be seen against the backdrop of the appointment of a new Minister of Antiquities in 2014, and he was part of the new Egyptian government who was very keen to create a good impression in the world media. And so as a result, a lot of permits were given to projects that were seen to have a high media profile and seen to be very high tech and modern. Now, so when Nick Reeves published his hypothesis in 2015, it was not long until he was given permission to carry out a radar survey in the Valley of the Kings. And these radar surveys can see below the surface of the plaster into the walls, up to 3 or 4 meters into the walls. So in late 2015, Nick Reeves turned up on site with his colleague, Watanabe, who is a radar expert. And he brought one radar machine, a 400 megahertz low frequency machine that's good for seeing far into the walls. And on the day of the scans, there was a great media excitement on site and around the world, and lots of people on site reminiscent of the scenes from the actual excavation of the tomb in 1922. And Reeves and Watanabe carried out 2 scans in the tomb, along the mid-level of the north wall and the west wall. And at the end of the day, they emerged from the tombs and made some announcements. Reeves stated that clearly it does look from the radar evidence as if the tomb continues as I have predicted. The radar behind the north wall seems pretty clear. If I am right, it is a corridor continuation of the tomb which will end in another burial chamber. The Minister of Antiquities announced that we said earlier there was a 60% chance there is something behind the walls, but now after the initial reading of the scans, we are now saying it's 90% likely there's something behind the walls. Watanabe added, there is in fact an empty space behind the wall based on radar, which is very accurate. There is no doubt. So this seems very convincing, but I have to say I was surprised at the speed that these announcements were made. And also I managed to see some screenshots of the scans, and really I couldn't see anything that looked obviously like anomalies or shapes of walls or wall surfaces. So I remained sceptical at the time, and I warned colleagues not to accept the findings until something was formally published. But we were promised results to be published within the month. So after 1 month, there were no results formally published. And after 2 months, I wrote a blog post calling for full publication of the results. And also I said that if the results in fact had not found anything, then that was an important result to publish as well. Negative findings are as important as positive findings. And in fact, there's nothing negative about a negative finding. It just means that you've demonstrated there is nothing to be found. So the following year, in mid-2016, the Minister of Antiquities was replaced by a new Minister of Antiquities who seems to have been much keener to promote a traditional archaeological approach. And he actually said that the objective was not to find hidden chambers, it was to find the truth. So I was encouraged by that. And shortly after he was appointed, a second project was brought in to try and confirm the results of the first scans. And this time it was a team from the National Geographic in the United States, a very experienced team. And they brought two machines in, a low frequency machine at the same frequency as Watanabe's machine of 400 megahertz, and an intermediate frequency machine running at 900 megahertz, which is better for seeing details closer to the wall surface in more detail. So they carried out a more comprehensive survey. They carried out scans at 5 different levels on each wall, and they carried these out at both frequencies. So in total there was 40 scans taken over a period of 9 hours. And after they processed the results, they were unable to confirm the results of the first project, and they were not able to find evidence of any chambers. So this was quite problematic, but I have to say, not that surprising. So we can go forwards 2 years now to a third round of scans that was then planned to try and resolve this apparent discrepancy from the first two contradictory scans. And this time a team from the Polytechnic University of Turin was brought in under the direction of Professor Francesco Porcelli. And they're a very experienced team, and they brought 3 different machines in: a low frequency machine working at 150 to 200 megahertz, an intermediate frequency machine operating at 600 to 900 megahertz, and a high frequency machine operating at 1500 to 3000 megahertz. And so they carried out a very comprehensive survey, 3 teams working with the machines independently, and they calibrated the scans by looking back from the treasury into the burial chamber, so they could see their machines were working on the known and observable walls. And they also looked back from the annex into the antechamber, and they also tried to look back from the burial chamber all the way into the annex, which is around 5 meters, and they were unable to see that distance even with the low frequency machine. So that meant they knew the limits of their scanning ability. So they carried out many scans overlapping panels on each wall, very comprehensive on the north wall of the burial chamber and the west wall. And in conclusion, the Italian team concluded, "We agree with the conclusions of the second GPR survey, which did not confirm Watanabe's results. We conclude with a high level of confidence that Reeves' theory concerning the existence of hidden chambers adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb is not supported by the GPR data." So in fact, they had carefully calibrated their machines and spent several days working out how to filter out any disruption in the data, reflections and so on. And they published their results in a peer-reviewed journal. And the results following the publication of that peer-reviewed paper were accepted by the Department of Antiquities. So they, in fact, stated that they had carried out 10 times more data scans than both of the other 2 projects combined. So really, the quality of the third and final scan was certainly the highest of the 3 scans. So to summarize, really, the 3 scans. The first scan was a basic scan carried out with a fairly old-fashioned machine, and the results were overinterpreted with a lot of wishful thinking and with little calibration. The second scan was much more thorough and collected a lot more data and was not able to repeat the results from the first scan. As a result, a fully comprehensive third scan was brought in, and it was carried out with 3 independent teams, which all arrived at the same conclusion, and they were unable to find evidence of any walls or chambers or backfilled corridors at all. So really, the end result of the radar scanning project was really quite clear that there is no evidence of any type of structures behind the north wall or the west wall in Tutankhamun's tomb. And so just a couple of other things I need to add is that in early 2019, an additional scan was carried out outside the tomb on the hillside to the north of the tomb. And they did apparently find evidence of an anomaly of sorts. However, their work has never been published, I did read a Nature blog article that reviewed the project, and they stated they had talked to the team and had seen a apparently unpublished report, and they produced they added a really nice fancy graphic where they had projected the shape of the anomaly down onto the same plane as the bottom of the burial chamber. So the clear implication was that this was an architectural continuation of KV62, but there's no evidence that this anomaly is connected to the tomb at all. And really, until anything is formally published, we can only really treat this as hearsay for the moment. And the second thing is that Reeves did obtain data from the second scan project, and he got an English radar expert to reprocess the data. However, the conclusions of his reprocessing and reanalysis of the data were really superseded by the third scan by the time they were published. Finally, to the lessons that can be learned, the first thing is when we make a hypothesis and when we test the hypothesis, it's really important that the results of the tests are taken into consideration. The hypothesis must be corrected, and negative findings must be accepted, and the hypothesis updated to take those into account. Wishful thinking is a good thing. It motivates people to do things, but when it comes to scientific experiments, especially ones at high-profile sites such as this UNESCO World Heritage Site, the science needs to be applied objectively and impartially. And we can see the effects where many different people were keen to see a positive outcome from this project, and the media and the politicians and the archaeologists. Really, I would say this is a good example of what's referred to as groupthink. A lot of people tend to get carried away, and there's a lack of good scientific judgment. And so we can see here that science is not all about fancy electronics. It's really about applying the scientific principles in an appropriate way. So the last thing I want to say is that Western scholars operating in Western universities really need to be careful about how they work with official departments of antiquities overseas. And because you're working within those countries, they have different objectives and concerns. But really, the Western scholars need to remain faithful to the scientific background they're working from. Now, I saw, which was quite worrying, one academic in a major American university actually went so far as to say that the Polytechnic University of Milan were engaged in a cover-up. And that's really quite worrying, and I think that kind of comment, the people involved need to really take a step back and reconsider that. So this is science, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's not a case of taking sides and cheering one on. It's about what is the actual reality here. So science works well when properly applied, properly calibrated. The truth is in fact often more interesting than fiction. And in the case of KV62, we can see that Nefertiti may not be behind the wall. But if we look at the science, we can actually find that Tutankhamun's mother has already been found. And we know from the DNA science that his mother is a mummy now referred to as KV35YL, is certainly Tutankhamun's mother. And her body is actually in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So she is possibly not, however, Nefertiti. In fact, the historical evidence suggests she's another daughter of Amenhotep III called Nebita or Bakataten. So there's certainly more research to be done and more science to be done, and there will be more information forthcoming if the science is properly applied. So I'm just going to wind up now, and I want to just point out that the Theban Mapping Project website, which covers the tomb KV62 and all the neighbouring tombs, is back online, happily. It's a great resource, full of great information. And I'm going to put a bibliography at the end of this video. And if you liked this discussion, please subscribe to the YouTube channel and press subscribe and like. And I will hopefully present another case study in the forthcoming weeks.